Thank you for having me. My apologies, my French is not that good. I am from Canada. I'm from Vancouver, Canada, and I grew up near Quebec, but then in the west coast of Canada. Truthfully, you're better off learning Cantonese or Mandarin than French now, so I've lost my French, so my apologies. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you today about wood and my practice, my architectural practice, and why we have chosen to be dedicated completely to the concept of building in wood. So I call my talk Evolution Revolution. I think the idea that wood construction is something that we have seen for centuries, but we have not seen as much for the last century. And here in Switzerland, there's a great history. Why is this not moving forward? Well, we're not moving forward. I'll do it here. I'm frozen. Hold on. It was working before. I just froze. That'll help. I can do this entire talk without having any pictures, but the pictures are way better. So, sorry guys, can somebody come and give me a little hand that this thing's not working? Oh, perfect. It's weird. Let me just talk while we do this. So I started my practice actually in 2003 originally, and we were just a regular architecture practice until about 7 years ago when I'd built a lot of things in wood and really started to understand, here we go, beautiful, thank you very much, understand what and why wood was going to become something that I felt this next century needs to focus on as a building material. So I'm going to tell you the story of why we are building in wood. And as mentioned in the introduction, I run this firm, Michael Green Architecture. I also run this school, Design Build Research, which has a program called Timber Online Education that we're trying to create a global free education program translated into 35 different languages to change the entire system of building worldwide, educating countries especially that need to move towards greener building materials like China and India and Indonesia, Brazil, and so forth. So we've built this program. And then finally, my practice, I actually sold it to a company called 𝗖𝗺 a year ago. So I still run the company and fairly independently, but we have a relationship with 𝗖𝗺, which is a Silicon Valley company about 4 years old now that is trying to really create some shifts in both technology as well as off-site construction. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about that because it's a pretty important step that's starting to happen in the United States and elsewhere, so especially here in Europe, but now finally in the United States. So here we are, and I'm going to describe it, but 7 years ago when I started, I bought one of the first pieces of what's called mass timber. That piece of wood right there this is my staff moving into my office when I started the firm over, and that's what we call mass timber. So mass timber is the word we use for large panels of wood. Cross-laminated timber is something you hopefully have all heard of already, but it's the change that's coming to our industry is these large panel products in wood. And when I started the firm, we came up with a sort of series of values that we wanted to speak to. The first is embrace the sun. We only work in materials ideally grown by the power of the sun. So obviously wood is one of them. We try to solve real problems. We try to innovate and share, which is why we have our school. We believe that Darwin was right. And what I mean by that is that evolution has taught us and Darwin's work taught us that the idea that all species, flora and fauna on Earth, are really fundamentally here to thrive and propagate and use as little energy as possible to do so, and to find evolutionary ways to use less energy. And the only species that has not done that is us, as humans. We do the best to use the most energy and then destroy ourselves. We're very good at this, but this has to change. And so our practice is focused on the idea that we design to use less, not more, more. And then finally, I always say that we have to be Canadian. And what I mean by that is the work we design, you will see, is very simple. It's very quiet. It's not trying to say, look at me. It's trying to say that we need to be good neighbors. And that's, for me, what great architecture should do most of the time. Sometimes we should celebrate buildings, but much of the time we should be very humble and honest and quiet. And I think those are good Canadian values, so I always say that. We build projects all over the world. We're very lucky to do so, and about 3/4 of what we do are custom projects, and about 25% are what we call typological projects or repeatable projects. And that's where we have really find this interest to working with this company, 𝗖𝗺, who are starting to look at the idea that buildings can be a product, not just one-off prototypes all the time, but actually something that we can create some repeatability around to reduce the cost, which we think is important. About 90% of what we do is this massive timber, and about 10% is what's called light timber, light wood, which is what you see in North America a lot. It's less common here, but it's a very common way. And so the two main values of why we run the firm are climate and social impact, but really I'm here to tell you the story of why we build in wood. So in North America, we have been building in wood like this for 300 or 400 years. And really from the beginning of what we call the First Nations people, the Aboriginal people of North America building in wood, there's been a change only in small ways throughout time of these lightweight wood buildings, eventually evolving into where we are today, which is advanced wood and mass timber. Mass timber really started in Austria, in Germany, and to some extent here in Switzerland. It's a material that started to shift the way wood would be brought into buildings in Europe, but really around the small-scale residential market. And we became really interested in mass timber because we were used to these small pieces of wood, and we were interested in what these large engineered wood panels might do for us in the construction market. And it's really what we call apples and oranges because, of course, these big materials, when they burn, they're very resilient to fire, which means we can think about them building much, much bigger buildings, which is really important. So there's a whole bunch of types of mass timber. I won't spend a lot of time. I can answer questions about it, but these are all the different products that are now available, many of which are made here in Switzerland and made especially in Scandinavia, of course. But what I'm here to do is really tell you this story. What is it that makes us so passionate about the idea that my entire practice is dedicated to wood? I think we're the only architectural firm in North America that has said we are only going to work in this material. And it's these four things. So let me take you through them. The environment, cost, and offsite, and finally health and jobs. So I'm going to walk you through the story. But first, for me, the biggest passion I have around the use of wood is about the issue of the environment and how we have to change. So I'm sure you know these statistics. My apologies if you know them very well, but I'm going to repeat them because I think they're important to all of us in the room involved in construction. This is what we should be thinking every day. Our industry is responsible globally for 40% of greenhouse gases, depending where we live in the world. In Canada, it's 50%. In the United States, it's 50%. I don't know what it is here in Switzerland, but I imagine it's probably close to 50% of the issues of climate change are related to our industry. It breaks down like this. Many people think it's about transportation, and of course it is, but buildings are the primary issue. And when we think about that 39%, close to 40%, it's about 11% is what the materials of the building are, the embodied carbon, and 28% operational. We talk about operational, how you heat and cool a building all the time, and it's a very important issue. But what we don't talk enough about is what we make our buildings out of. And I'll explain now why I think that's actually the more important issue. But it relates to this, the scale, right? As a building industry, this is how much square footage. Sorry, it's in square foot. I guess I pulled this from a slide from an American talk. So drop a zero and it's roughly square meters. But 2.5 trillion square feet of building has to be built in the next 30 years, 35 years in the world, which is the equivalent of building one New York City every month for 40 years. So effectively, this is the scale of building that's going to be happening in the world. One New York City every month for the next 40 years to meet population growth, migration, and urbanization issues worldwide. Obviously, that's not an issue as big here in Switzerland, nor is it as big an issue in Canada, but it's an issue that we should all care about. Every building we do is an opportunity to tell a story. Tell a story about the environment, to tell a story about social impact issues, and to tell a story that hopefully teaches countries that will be a bigger part of that big, massive amount of square footage about how they can build better buildings. So when we break down individual buildings, about 72% of the carbon footprint is embodied, is operational, and about 28% is the embodied material. And so people often say to me, well, why aren't you just focused on the operational? That's the majority, 78%. Well, the reason is because of what we call the time value proposition, and this graph really gives us a good idea. The first day you build the building, you've built it with the materials. That's your embodied footprint. So day one is the yellow on this chart. Of course, over time, heating and cooling is adding up your carbon footprint. The intersection of those points you can see in this particular example, and depends, in this particular example is roughly in 2035. So for the first 15 years in this example, the most important issue is actually what the building's made out of. Now, by changing our sources of heating and cooling, our energy sources towards green energy, we have the opportunity to reduce the curve on the blue. But currently, we have no conversation really happening globally about the fact that day one, the embodied impact is our carbon footprint and is currently unchangeable. Every material you put into a building, unless it's been grown by the power of the sun, has a very large carbon footprint. So there are materials that are inevitably going to go into the building: glass, aluminum, steel, concrete. These materials have high carbon footprints. So I'm always looking for opportunities to flip that around. Now, again, you probably all know these statistics, but I like to just put them there, and that's the IPCC's sort of focus on telling us that how do we get to 1.5 degrees centigrade change over the next maximum over the next century, for the rest of the century. And this was the goal that IPCC told us. To get there, we need to peak today, or next year, and be down 45% by 2030, and then net zero by 2040 to 55. Now, I understand Switzerland has a goal of 2050 being net zero, and how you get there is obviously very complicated. And obviously why I'm here to talk about buildings is that the only way we get there is by changing what we make them out of. So to get there, I think is unrealistic. We are not, unfortunately, going to get there. We can't transform the building industry this quickly. We can't transform a whole bunch of industries this quickly. And sadly, I think many of us now believe we're going to end up at 3 to 4 degrees centigrade change over the next century. In Canada, the federal government just released a report that says that in Canada, we expect 6 to 12 degrees centigrade increase. And this is because our north is melting. We're not holding as much snow throughout the year. We don't get the reflective qualities, and we're going to release an enormous amount of CO2 because of release emissions from our tundra and the melting of the tundra. This is catastrophic from an environmental point of view for our country, and it's obviously, depending where you are in the world, a different story. But for us, we actually will see the highest temperature changes of almost any country in the world. So it's a big, big deal. So what you can see is the issue of what you make a building out of, the embodied story of that building between now and 2050, when we need to get to net zero, is roughly 50% of the conversation. But it's really not been 50% of the conversation. It's been a tiny, if at all, part of the construction industry's conversation. And the only way we're going to do that is by the choice of materials that we put into our buildings. And this is a really good example. It shows you each of the materials that are typical to common building practices, with concrete way on the left there and mass timber way on the right here, as far as the strict choice of your structural system and what that might mean to you from a carbon footprint point of view. And if you don't know the statistic, it's a really important one. And the reason wood construction is so effective is because 1 cubic meter of wood stores 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So the two things, obviously, we do to counteract climate change is we find ways to reduce our emissions, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and then find ways to store greenhouse gases. So wood is the only major building material, and certainly the only structural material I can choose from that does both those two things. Concrete and steel together represent almost 11% of man's greenhouse gas emissions. So the choice of concrete for me in particular is a material that's wonderful, but a material I need to dramatically reduce in my buildings in order to make a difference in these kind of ways that will hopefully help us reach these goals that we have that are very ambitious. So that also requires that we come from certified forestry, and this is less of an issue here in Europe, where I think forestry models are pretty good. North America, we're pretty good. But much of the rest of the world, we have real challenges of where wood comes from, and obviously cutting down trees, deforestation in particular, represents another 20% of man's greenhouse gas emissions. So the last thing we want to do is build buildings out of wood that are coming from the wrong place in an unsustainable forestry practice. The big shift for us also is understanding that these wood products that, as I said, started in Austria and Switzerland and Germany, these mass timber products, which were really there to say we want to take a dent into the residential market. We want to increase the amount of wood, especially in Western Austria. That community said, we've got a forestry industry. We want to build more in wood. How do we do it? We need to make materials that are robust, that are strong like concrete, because that's our competitor. And they started building two-story houses, maybe three-story buildings. In Switzerland, until recently, the building code only allowed 2 stories in wood. Right? So the thought was that that was how we were going to see these materials be introduced. But for us in North America, we take small wood, light wood, and we build already 4- and 6-story tall wood buildings. And so for us, we realized that we needed to change where wood would be used. It can't be used in the suburbs, just in the suburbs. It can't be used just in rural environments, because where people are moving is into cities. And we're going to hear later a really interesting talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and I can't wait for it. But the reality right now is that the world is about 50% urban. We're moving likely towards being 70% urban. And that means we need to take wood products and design them for cities. And for me, that meant it was clear that the only way I could take this wonderful invention from Central Europe and bring it to Canada, where we have a lot of trees and where forestry is important, is to reinvent how that material ultimately would be used in our building culture, which meant urban and larger scale. And so we found urban solutions, and about 12 years ago now, I wrote a book called The Case for Tall Wood Buildings. And it's the reason we should start building big buildings in wood. And we put it out there, and truthfully, the industry and my peers thought I was crazy. They thought there is no way people will ever build buildings like this. And so we proposed, this is in New York City for Cornell University, and we proposed the idea of building 30-story tall buildings made in structures entirely of wood. And we sat down with some very good engineers to prove that that was possible. And again, people just told me it wasn't possible. Well, 139 years ago, the first skyscraper was built. And when it was built in Chicago. Chicago invented the elevator, so they were able to start exploring this idea of building bigger buildings. And the first tall building was made, of course, in wrought iron, and it was made 10 stories tall, and people at the time thought it was so big and so scary that they wouldn't walk across the street near it. They thought it was an impossibility, right? And now, of course, we look at 10 stories and think nothing of it. So we did an exercise to tell the story of how this is possible. We worked, again, with some very good wood engineers, some of the best in the world. By the way, Switzerland also has some of the best, if not the best, wood engineers in the world. People that are my heroes are here in Switzerland. But we sat back and we said, well, how do we communicate the idea that what you could really do? How big a vision could we attach to the idea that we can take this material known for building barns and farm buildings and small houses and say, no, we could do much more? And so we showed that this building that you all recognize could have been built entirely in wood. And technically it could. And it's 102 stories tall. And when people say that's ridiculous, I always point out that where I live, this is how big the trees are. And it only takes 3 of them to get to the top of the Empire State Building. And so, of course, it's possible for us to take this amazing natural material and really understand it, its properties, and figure out how to do something much different with the way we build our cities. So we developed these ideas, and it really is the first new way to build a skyscraper in a century. And so although my peers thought this was crazy, we spent a ton of time trying to change the way the public thought about these buildings. And what happened, to kind of my surprise, is that in a very short amount of time, we have seen building codes all over the world start to change, and very quickly. Because I think this intersection of the idea that we have to solve climate issues, we have to solve urbanization issues, we have to solve population growth issues, we need to meet human needs, and we need to do it in a way complementary to the carbon issues we deal with meant that this is a problem that has a proper solution. And so in Canada, our building code changed for next year that allows us to build 12 stories tall. We are already planning buildings much bigger than 12 stories in Canada. But I'll just show you, this is the first tall wood building we did, and the second one in the world. The first was in the United Kingdom, in London, by Andrew Waugh. But this building was our first one and the first in North America, and it's not very tall. It didn't need to be. It was in a very small community. But we wanted to show its possibility, and so this building has nothing but wood after you leave the ground. So the foundation is concrete, but 100% of the rest of the building is made in mass timber and engineered products. So I won't go into the details of exactly how it was built. I'm happy to answer questions about it. But it's an office building and a university building as its function. It was built with a lot of flexibility to run services through it so that it would be as good or better than any other kind of technically performing steel or concrete building. It's a very warm and beautiful building that we're very proud of. But what's really exciting about this kind of building is when we did 2 major studies looking at the life cycle of the building, how from the very, very beginning of where the products come from, to the erection of the building, to the operating of the building, and to the dismantling of the building, in this case over a 100-year period, what we were able to demonstrate is just by the simple fact that we chose products from wood and grown by the sun products rather than steel or concrete, we could reduce the carbon footprint of this one building by 88%. So now think back to the idea that we all have to build one New York City every month for the next 40 years. This matters a lot. This is the way we get there. And for now, this is the way we get there. And when people ask me, yeah, but what about this deforestation issue? Aren't we going to cut down the world's trees if we do this? And yeah, there is a threat we could, and we have to do this very well and very responsibly, and we really need to be educating our foresters around this. But a wonderful statistic is that building I just showed you, the North American forest grows enough wood every 4 minutes to build that building, right? It's really astounding to think about. Of course, with natural products, they are constantly growing, and there is a manageable solution to this. And if you look at the world's forest, these are the green reflex forests that are actually in positive growth, the gray neutral, and the red, of course, Brazil you can see, or Indonesia, where we're seeing deforestation. We actually think that this is part of the story. We're really invested with our school, Timber Online Ed, around the idea that if we can take countries like Brazil or Indonesia and teach them to build with their wood products, that there's actually an incentive to not just cut down trees and turn it into agricultural land or grazing land. I don't know why I lost the screen. But there's actually an opportunity to to use their products, regrow trees, and actually do what the United Nations has been trying to convince them to do for a long time, and create afforestation, so take agricultural land, convert it back to forest, because we can change the land value proposition for them such that forestry, because it can be sold into their construction market, actually has a huge economic return. And countries like Brazil and Indonesia, we can use eucalyptus trees that take only 7 years to grow to a maturity to build huge structural products. A 7-year growth cycle is a game changer for the Amazon. And we have to convince them, but first we have to change their entire building culture away from concrete and towards wood. So the story is really interesting, and it's a global conversation and really interesting, and I hope you will join me in starting to think about your buildings being built this way. But I recognize also for many of you, it's not just about the environment, it's also about cost. So let me walk you through that. So the big change in these products is that they are built obviously in a fabrication plant. They are then cut with CNC cutters, so they're highly accurate. They're built, they're manufactured off-site. When they're brought to the site as panels, they fit together very efficiently and very quickly. So the big change from a cost point of view is the length of time it takes to build a building is greatly reduced. So in the example of that building I showed you, traditionally that building might in our environment take 24 months to build, 18 to 24 months to build. From the beginning of design to the end of construction, we did it in 13.5 months. So we're able to shorten every aspect of the construction process, which obviously from a financing point of view starts to be something important for you to consider. And reducing that time you know, you can obviously fill the building quicker and so forth, means that we have to also think about the cost of these buildings differently than the way we think of others. So I'm not sure how you all talk about cost of construction, but in North America, we talk about cost per square foot, and we only are really talking about the construction cost per square foot. But what we need to talk about is the project cost per square foot, which is not part of our current culture. But why that has to become part of the conversation is if we reduce the time, it is not captured in construction costs. It's captured, obviously, in finance costs, in management costs, all these other project costs. And then these buildings become very, very economical. It's also fundamentally, I believe, the best material to really unlock the problem of building off-site. And so, you know, I often talk about how I get to design a building in a nice warm space, and then the poor guys that build it are building in the pouring rain or the snow. It's pretty tough construction building outside, and it's very inefficient, right? Construction sites are very unpredictable because of weather conditions, delivery conditions, all of these issues that you all as builders understand are very complicated and very expensive. So moving towards off-site, and the more we can do in a factory obviously means that we have an opportunity to lower the cost, increase the quality, reduce the waste. These are all really important steps for us. And why I think mass timber and is such a critical part of that is steel and concrete are too heavy to build in a factory. They really don't work, right? We have some precast concrete and so forth, but it's a very heavy system for off-site construction. Light wood and light steel do work for off-site construction, but they tend to be very flexible in their construction. So when you build either a volume in a factory or a panel in a factory, and you lift it up onto the truck, it'll twist and rack. And so you can't put a lot of finishes on that panel or in that space. You can't put all of your finishes because you have to expect that while you drive down the highway or lift it by crane to put it into your building, that there's going to be movement. And that movement will cause cracking, things to fall off the walls, or you have to put a lot of temporary braces in it. What that means is that material is, although light, it's just too flexible. So mass timber sits in this perfect sweet spot where it's both robust enough, it's strong enough, and accurate enough to be cut in the factory and allow you to complete the finishes on it. And when you pick it up, it's not going to be flimsy, but it's light enough that you can pick it up, unlike steel and concrete. So it resides in the perfect place for bigger buildings, not for small buildings from an economic point of view, at least for us in North America. I really mean buildings that are taller than 6 to 8 stories and bigger, typically, or institutional buildings, big buildings like that. So as I said, we were able to build this building in 14 months, which is very unusual for us. And a big part of it is the difference between building with wet construction, concrete, where you're waiting constantly for things to dry, versus dry construction, which means you never are waiting. You can keep the trades working at all times. And so that's part of the story of cost. The other story is really health and jobs. And I think whereas the construction industry for the last decade and a half has talked a lot about the very important issue of the environment and sustainability, we are starting to move into a generation, and I think Switzerland is also a leader in this, of thinking about our buildings as being fundamentally part of health and well-being. So we can choose by our building materials, the materials that have obviously low VOCs, that don't give us poor air quality, but we can also choose materials that actually nurture and create healthier environments for our kids and for people that are sick. And so what we're finding typically, I mean, we spend about 90% of our time in Western cultures inside buildings. And so we are surrounded with what I think for the last century has been these artificial man-made materials. We don't really know the human health effects of all of them. We think we know, but we don't. And we learn constantly that materials that, like asbestos, maybe wasn't such a good idea, or lead maybe wasn't such a good idea. We slowly learn what works and what doesn't work. But what we know does work is the materials that our species have lived around for millennia, which is natural materials, stone, wood. And what we also seem to know, and the social science is showing us, is that when we work in wood buildings, we are more productive. When we learn in wood buildings, we learn more quickly. When we are healing in wood buildings, it reduces our stress levels and we heal quicker. So we were seeing a whole bunch of building types, from schools to wellness centers, hospitals, spas, universities, all realizing that this dynamic of what you're building and the space around you is informing not just how you feel, but actually how productive you are. And so we're working now with Silicon Valley companies that have done a lot of research into this, where they start to understand, well, human productivity is exactly what we're in the business to do. If I can get 5, 10% more out of my team because they're happier and more comfortable and have less stress simply by choosing a material that happens to also be good for the planet, why would I not change my entire portfolio of buildings to building this way, which is exactly what they're doing. So I'll just show you a few more buildings. We've built airports. This is City Hall in North Vancouver, where I live, all in different types of mass timber products. I'm just going to go quickly just to make sure I can focus on other content. But just to give you a feel, these are the kinds of products out there that allow us to build really beautiful buildings and really quiet, simple buildings. This is a material made in British Columbia it's like plywood. It's laminated veneer lumber, it's called. But it's incredibly beautiful. And in this case, our client, this was built into an existing building. This is the first time the material was used. But the client said, I don't want any drywall. I don't want any paint. I just want this material. So we built every wall panel, every door out of this material, filling this existing space. When we were asked to design this project is what's called a Ronald McDonald House. So you may associate that with the restaurant McDonald's. It's actually a home for families with kids with cancer. It's a very, very important charity that does very good work. And basically it means that if you live in a small community in British Columbia or the Yukon, another territory of Canada, and your child gets sick, you actually are flown that day to Vancouver, where our children's hospital is. And immediately your life is turned upside down. And so this is a home you can stay in for very little money, $7 a day, be surrounded by other families going through what you're going through, and you often are there for 2 years of cancer treatment with your children. And so when we built this, it was a huge, it's actually for me one of the most important projects I've ever been involved in. And what we realized is we, of course, also wanted to demonstrate other things. We wanted to innovate socially around how families would integrate, and I unfortunately won't be able to talk about that, why I think we did some really special things there. But from a technological point of view, we also wanted to demonstrate something really important, is that in North America, I needed to tell a story that these materials aren't just there to build skyscrapers, which we're doing, or big commercial buildings. They're also there to build institutional buildings. I think if you're a university in the United States, this is the way you should be building. 100% of universities in the United States that have a carbon agenda, a green agenda, must move towards this way of building. And so we wanted to show it was possible. So although that's brick on the outside, it's entirely made with cross-laminated timber on the inside. So we took these panels, 20-meter panels, and tilted them up, and then used what we call light wood cassettes for the floors. And there it is under construction. We covered it in brick because we live in a very rainy climate, and brick is a very durable, long-term material, and I wanted this building to be a 200-year building with no maintenance, or as minimal maintenance as possible. By the way, this is also passive house building, so we do tend to move towards, wherever possible, designing either near passive or passive house, which of course here in Europe is also much more popular than it is at home for me. So again, these buildings don't have to look like wood buildings. They can look like any other building. This is actually a light wood building that was off-site built. This is a very lightweight industrial building that we built in Vancouver. There's 𝗰cie in the back corner there. If you haven't come, it's really pretty, but not the architecture. The architecture is all concrete. It's not pretty. But the building and the environment is gorgeous, and we are slowly moving towards building more in wood. In our city in Vancouver, which wants to be the greenest city in the world and talks as though we are the greenest city in the world, and I think we have some room for improvement, we have a new carbon policy with 6 major points, and that's going to deal with mass transportation, that's going to deal with, obviously, roads and the number of cars we have and the shift to electric vehicles. All these things are part of normal conventional city planning of any green city. But what's really great, I think, is that one of our 6 points is going to be a 40% reduction in the embodied carbon of buildings. And what that means is the skyline I live around of concrete buildings, including concrete towers, must change. By 2021, if we enact this policy, we still have some ways to go politically, but if we enact it, 40% reduction in embodied forces the hand of every builder to rethink what they make buildings out of, and will move us to being a mass timber culture. We have the wood for it, and we have a great community of wood builders, just like you do here in Switzerland. Other, just kind of for fun, just to show you, we work on projects of all different types. This is actually a music studio for Dr. Dre in Utah. It's not happening yet, but hopefully we do. But when you build in a mountain environment, this is on top of a ski hill, we get very short build cycles. We get, in this case, we get about 4.5 months where there's no snow. So we go in with mass timber because, as I described, speed is everything. This is what the music studio looked like at night. This is at Whistler Blackcomb. This is a 250-seat restaurant on top of the mountain. It's a beautiful site. Again, in this case, we get 3 months with no snow. So we are trying to figure out, well, how do we build an entire building like this in 3 months? It's a large building, off-site construction. But you know, these are the other reasons. It's not just about building in urban environments. These materials have this application for speed. And this one's very special to me. My family, my father immigrated to Canada from Scotland, and he arrived in the high Arctic of Canada, which is where I was born, in a community of Inuit people, if you know the word Inuit, I think. And you know, no roads there, very traditional living. When my dad first was there, he was dog sledding and living in igloos when they traveled, you know, regular homes normally. But my dad learned to speak Inuktitut, the language of the North, which very few Canadians, non-Inuit Canadians, can speak. And this is the first language center for the Inuit. And so it's the same problem. It's in this very remote place, but how do we build it? We get 1 ship a year. The rest of the time it's ice, for now. And so again, these kinds of buildings are perfect for building off-site construction, arriving with the components and these large panels to be able to build them very quickly and robustly for these harsh environments. So I've got only a few more minutes. I'm going to take you through what's happening in the rest of the world. In the United States, the building code has now changed to 18 stories, or will change in 2021 to 18 stories are allowed in wood. This is one of our projects in Minneapolis. This is the first tall wood building in the United States. Again, it doesn't really look like it. It's built into an industrial area, but the game changer for this, it was built by Hines, who, if you know Hines as a developer in the United States, they are a very big player in the United States. They have built 1,800 skyscrapers in their portfolio. So they are very good at this. They own a lot of big buildings in the United States. They turned to us, you know, about 4 or 5 years ago and said, we'd like to actually rethink the future of workplace. We think that instead of big towers, we think that a lot of our customers, these AAA commercial clients, are saying, we're having a hard time attracting people, and we're having a hard time retaining people. You know, as the baby boomers retire, there's this vacuum of employment that's a really serious issue worldwide, and especially in North America. And so we need to rethink what people want. And what we're finding is the younger generation, to attract them and to retain them, they want workplaces that are interesting. They don't want to be in a boring lay-in tile, concrete, steel building. They want to be in a funky neighborhood with good cafes and restaurants and a building of character. And so why don't we go back to the way we built a century ago, these old industrial buildings? Why don't we build them in wood? And why don't we make space that actually works you know, we can wire them, they heat and cool well, rather than just renovating old buildings. Let's start building them again. And so we built this building with them, in this case with what's called nail laminated timber. And it became, what's really interesting, this big powerhouse developer in the US, it became internally with their staff, who were mostly very skeptical of this. And this is only 7 stories tall. It's not very big. Tiny for them, tiny project. It became the most important project they've done probably in the last 20 years, and the most popular with their own staff in the last 20 years. And so what's happened for them is they've turned around and said, we're going to build, originally it was going to be 15 more of these. Now they're talking about 40, 50 more, and they have investors coming. And this is, for me, the most visited building I've ever built. And it's really very simple. But it demonstrates this desire people have to rethink the way they live, to rethink the way they work. and to start building buildings again that maybe do reflect the way we built buildings a century ago. The technology is new. The fire science is new. The opportunity in seismic regions and earthquake regions like we live in are new. We can do these buildings really effectively and really cost effectively. And here in Switzerland, because you all have some of the best wood producers in the world, certainly the best fabricators, and I've been to a number of the shops here, it means that, you know, it's really an opportunity. And right next door, what's happening in France, after the Paris Climate Accord, France said we need to actually put our money where our mouth is. We want to take responsibility around our climate agenda, and we are going to shift a huge component of our construction industry towards wood. So we were invited by the city of Paris over and over and over again to compete for projects. And we have a few projects in Paris. They go very slow. Paris projects go very slow for me. But they're wood, and that's what we're seeing, and you may notice it as well. You're seeing, and Lyon obviously is a center for wood in France. You're seeing a huge amount of the projects coming out of France now shifting towards cross-laminated timber, doing it as part of climate policy, but also doing it because there's a new enthusiasm that people have towards designing in these buildings and working them. So in this case, we're working with on a development that we won a competition for, and that's the development, all in wood originally. Up at the top of the page there sorry, up at the top you can see the Eiffel Tower. So we are actually only doing 2 of these towers. On the right is Kengo Kuma, a wonderful Japanese architect who's doing a hotel, and we're helping teach him how to do these building in wood. And then some Milan firms and from some French firms are doing the other parts of the project. But this is the scale of thinking now that's starting to happen in France. And France doesn't actually have a timber industry. So they've said we need to do this, but they really don't have an expertise in it. They're importing the wood from Austria for the most part. And so it speaks again to the idea that policy around climate is shifting towards wood building. So developers in North America are recognizing that, am I over time one? Yeah, I'm gonna finish. Developers are realizing that it's an opportunity right now to step into the forefront of your industry, to lead by example, to try these new building materials and really shift the portfolio you have towards a much greener agenda. And those that have done it so far, certainly in North America and I think now in France, are recognizing that by being first, they become the leader pretty quickly. And it's a huge opportunity, I think. And although your building codes here in Switzerland still need to evolve to allow this to happen more and bigger, that happens because of all of you stepping up and saying our industry is tired of doing it the same old way. Our industry actually understands how we can do better. And our industry is willing to take ownership of the 40% story that we all own if we don't do anything of climate. So I will conclude there, but I welcome you to consider wood in your future. And I'll take any questions when we're through afterwards. But thank you very much.